The smell of motor oil lingered in the air. It always did. Arthur stood at the rusted sink of his cramped apartment, a block of coarse pumice soap grating against his knuckles. He dug his thumbnails into the deep creases of his palms, trying to lift the grease that had settled permanently into his lifelines. It was a stubborn, ashen stain, the quiet mark of a man who traded the raw strength of his back for his son's next meal. From the narrow, unlit hallway, a soft breath whistled. Leo. 7 years old, clutching a frayed stuffed bear, missing one button eye, fast asleep on a mattress that had lost its spring years ago. Arthur dried his hands on a towel rougher than sandpaper. He walked into the dim room, his heavy work boots traded for worn-out socks to muffle his footsteps. He paused, leaning down to pull the thin, starched blanket over the boy's narrow shoulders. Life had never handed Arthur a winning hand. It had handed him a broken wrench, a mountain of overdue medical bills, and a hollow space where a wife used to be. She had packed her bags one rainy Tuesday, claiming the smell of exhaust and cheap dinners was suffocating her youth. She left without a backward glance. Now there was only Leo. This quiet, observant boy who looked at him like he hung the stars in the night sky. Arthur would carry the weight of the world on his bruised shoulders if it meant keeping the sky from falling on his son. He stepped out of the room, leaving the door cracked just enough to let a sliver of hallway light guide the boy's dreams. Miles away, across the pulsing veins of the city, the air tasted entirely different. It smelled of imported leather, sanitized air conditioning, and cold ambition. Elena stood by the floor-to-ceiling windows of her penthouse, looking down at the glittering grid of traffic. The glass felt like ice against her forehead. She was 32, the youngest CEO of a multinational logistics empire, and she was drowning in the shallow, stagnant waters of the dating pool. The men she met wore bespoke Italian suits and smiled with too many teeth. They looked at her, but they never saw her. They saw a lucrative portfolio. They saw an acquisition to merge with their own assets. Just 3 hours ago, she had endured another painful dinner at a Michelin-starred restaurant. The venture capitalist sitting across from her had spent 40 minutes humble bragging about his new yacht before casually calculatingly steering the conversation toward her company's stock options. The memory made her stomach twist in knots. She wanted a genuine connection. She wanted someone who would sit across a worn wooden table, ask how her day was, and actually listen to the answer without calculating his return on investment. The silence of her sprawling empty apartment amplified her isolation. Wealth had built a fortress around her, but the walls were suffocating. She pulled away from the window, dropping onto a sprawling white sofa that felt more like a museum exhibit than a place to rest her aching head. She picked up her phone. The dating app icon mocked her from the screen. With a heavy, deliberate sigh, she opened it and began deleting her polished, curated life. The professional headshots taken in Milan, the charity gala gowns, the subtle flecks of a diamond watch, she wiped them all away. Instead, she scrolled back years into her camera roll, finding a blurry, poorly lit photo taken at a local public park on a rainy day. She wore an oversized, faded flannel shirt. Zero makeup. Her hair was pulled back into a messy, uneven knot. She looked exhausted. She looked painfully ordinary. She navigated to her bio, deleting the impressive credentials. Her fingers flew across the keyboard, crafting a new reality. Elena, 32, working 2 jobs just to keep the lights on, drowning in student loans and bad luck. If you're looking for someone to split a fancy dinner swipe left, I can barely afford a cup of coffee right now. It was a lie born of sheer desperation. A crude filter designed to catch the predators who hunted for gold and perhaps let someone real slip through the net. She stared at the screen for a long moment, questioning her own sanity before hitting save. The profile went live. Back in the cramped, drafty apartment, Arthur sat at his scarred kitchen table. The wood groaned under the weight of his elbows. A stack of final notice bills sat neatly next to a half-empty mug of lukewarm, bitter tea. He opened the same app. He didn't know what he was searching for. Companionship felt like a luxury he had no right to afford. Most women on his screen posed in front of exotic beaches or held crystal glasses of champagne. He swiped past them, feeling the vast, unbridgeable canyon between his calloused world and their pristine one. Then a face appeared. No heavy makeup, no forced, practiced smile. Just a woman in a faded flannel shirt, looking like the world had worn her down to the bone, yet she was still standing. He read the bio. Working 2 jobs, barely afford coffee. Arthur felt a quiet tug in his chest, a flicker of profound recognition. He knew that bone-deep exhaustion. He knew the metallic taste of swallowed pride. His rough, scarred thumb hovered over the glowing screen. He didn't care about the loans or the empty bank accounts. He cared about the raw honesty in her tired eyes. He pressed the green icon. The bell above the door of Patsy's diner chimed a dull, brassy note. Elena paused on the threshold. The air inside hung thick, layered with the greasy warmth of fried potatoes and the sharp chemical tang of cheap floor cleaner. It was a far cry from the lavender-infused oxygen pumped through her corporate headquarters. She pulled the collar of her thrifted olive green sweater tighter around her neck. The yarn felt coarse scratching against her collarbone. Unnecessary armor. She scanned the row of vinyl booths, tracing the cracked red seats patched with strips of silver duct tape. He was there, sitting in the furthest corner bathed in the sickly yellow glow of a flickering neon beer sign. Arthur. He wore a faded denim shirt buttoned precisely to the collarbone. The fabric carried the distinct, rigid creases of a man who ironed his only good clothes with meticulous care. His broad shoulders curved inward, making himself smaller in the cramped space. He stared at a glass of ice water, tracking the running condensation with a thick, calloused finger. Elena approached. Her scuffed boots squeaked against the linoleum. He looked up. His eyes held the color of a stormy sea, deep and weathered. He did not offer a slick, practiced grin. He merely offered a small, genuine curve of his lips. He stood his tall frame dwarfing the small table and wiped his palm against his jeans before extending a hand. Elena, it is good to meet you. His voice rumbled low and steady, like an engine humming in a quiet garage. She took his hand. The contact sent a strange jolt up her arm. It felt like gripping rough-hewn timber, lined with deep ridges and unyielding strength. Yet his hold remained incredibly gentle, entirely mindful of his own force. Arthur, thank you for coming, she managed to say, sliding into the booth opposite him. The vinyl sighed under her weight. A tired waitress slapped 2 laminated menus onto the sticky table and drifted away. Elena picked hers up. To the woman she truly was, the prices listed were less than the tax on her morning espresso. To the woman she pretended to be, these numbers required careful navigation. She played her part. She let her gaze linger on the right side of the page, her brow furrowing slightly. She bit her lower lip, projecting a quiet anxiety over a $6 turkey sandwich. Arthur watched her over the rim of his water glass. He recognized that specific tension. He knew the silent, agonizing math of a stretched budget. He lived it every Tuesday when the grocery bill threatened his rent money. He gently pushed his menu aside. "The pot roast here is decent," he said, keeping his tone light conversational. "Heavy enough to trick your stomach into thinking it's full until tomorrow. I usually get it when I've pulled a double shift at the shop." Elena looked up surprised. She expected pity. She expected the awkward, shuffling discomfort of a man realizing his date lacked resources. She waited for him to offer to buy her a steak, with a boastful puff of his chest asserting financial dominance. Instead, he offered solidarity. He normalized the struggle. "Pot roast sounds warm," she replied, her voice softening, dropping the defensive edge she usually carried into boardrooms. When the waitress returned, Arthur ordered a plate of fries and a black coffee. Elena hesitated, then ordered the pot roast. She felt a flash of genuine guilt. She was playing a game with a man who dealt in brutal realities. As they waited, the conversation flowed cautious but steady. Elena spun a web of half-truths. She spoke of exhaustion of balancing late-night shifts with a mountain of debts that never seemed to shrink. Every word felt like ash in her mouth, yet the emotions anchoring them were entirely real. The isolation, the fatigue of carrying a massive heavy world on her shoulders. Arthur listened. He did not interrupt to fix her problems. He did not offer empty platitudes about how things would eventually get better. He simply anchored his gaze on hers and nodded. "The world doesn't pause when you're tired," Arthur murmured, turning his coffee mug between his scarred hands. "It just expects you to keep walking. But sometimes you find a good pair of boots or a quiet corner, and you just sit for a minute." He leaned back, the neon light catching the permanent shadows under his eyes. "I fix engines all day. People bring me broken things, expect a miracle for $50. You nod, you bust your knuckles, you get the grease under your nails, and you send them on their way. You do it because someone at home needs the lights kept on." He mentioned Leo then. A brief, guarded mention of a little boy who liked drawing spaceships on the back of unpaid utility bills. As he spoke of his son, his hardened features softened entirely. A profound, fierce love leaked through the cracks of his stoic exterior. Elena felt a tight knot form in her throat. She spent her days surrounded by men who measured their worth in stock options and offshore accounts. Men who traded their families for a younger model or a better tax bracket. Sitting across from her was a man who measured his wealth in the smile of a 7-year-old boy. A man who owned nothing, yet possessed a quiet dignity that millions of dollars could never purchase. She reached across the table, picking up a salty fry from his plate. He nudged the glass ketchup bottle toward her. The ambient noise of the diner, the clattering plates, the low hum of the refrigerator, the distant sirens dissolved into the background. For the first time in a decade, Elena did not feel the need to guard her assets. She just felt the desperate urge to guard this fragile, honest connection. The porcelain plates clattered against the plastic tray as the waitress cleared their table, wiping down the vinyl with a damp rag that smelled faintly of bleach. She left a pale green slip of paper face down between them. The bill. The universal anchor that dragged every diner back to reality. Elena stared at the slip. She had orchestrated this exact moment in her mind a dozen times. She reached into her canvas, toed her fingers bypassing the sleek, heavy titanium card hidden in a zipped velvet pouch. That card commanded private jets and secured multi-million-dollar corporate acquisitions. Instead, she retrieved a flimsy plastic debit card linked to an isolated account holding exactly $4.12. "Let me get this," she offered, her voice pitching up a fraction to mimic eager independence. Arthur shook his head, a slow, grounded movement. He reached for his back pocket. "I asked you out. I covered the table. It is just the way I was raised." "No, please. We split it. I insist." She pushed the plastic card toward the edge of the table, her jaw set in a mask of stubborn pride. Arthur paused. He studied the fierce defensive posture of her shoulders. He understood that kind of pride. It was the only armor a person had left when the bank accounts ran dry and the world stopped offering favors. He nodded, relenting, and let her hand the card to the returning waitress. The seconds stretched. The diner hummed around them, the sizzle of meat on a flat-top grill, the low murmur of tired truck drivers in the next booth. The waitress slid the plastic through the bulky terminal strapped to her waist. A sharp electronic chirp pierced the noise. "Declined, hon," the waitress muttered, snapping the paper receipt off the machine. She didn't lace her tone with malice, just the weary indifference of a woman who saw empty bank accounts 5 times a shift. Elena performed her role. She widened her eyes, letting her jaw drop a fraction. She snatched the card back as if the plastic burned her skin. That can't be right. I transferred funds this morning, I swear." She dug frantically into her tote. She pulled out a crumpled $1 bill, smoothing it flat against the sticky table with trembling fingers. Next came a handful of dimes and quarters, the metal clinking a pathetic, hollow rhythm. She mapped out the exact geometry of poverty, the hot flush of shame creeping up her neck, the desperate scrambling math, the feeling of shrinking under the gaze of a stranger. She waited for the judgment. She waited for the inevitable shift in the air. In her world, men of wealth viewed financial hiccups as a contagious disease. A former suitor, a venture capitalist, had once berated a valet for 10 minutes over a misplaced parking ticket, his face twisted in ugly arrogance. She expected Arthur to clear his throat awkwardly. She expected him to look away in discomfort or, worse, toss a $20 bill onto the table with a theatrical flourish to highlight his role as the wealthy savior rescuing the poor maiden. Arthur did none of those things. He did not look at the waitress. He did not look at the crumpled dollar bill. He looked entirely at Elena. His large, grease-stained hand moved across the table. He did not trap her hand. He merely rested his heavy, warm palm over her frantic fingers, stilling their chaotic search for loose change. The calluses on his skin felt rough, a physical weight grounding her fabricated panic. "Elena," he rumbled, his voice dropping an octave, carrying the soft, steady rhythm of a metronome. "Breathe." He withdrew his hand, reached into his own pocket, and pulled out a worn leather wallet. It was thin, the edges frayed from years of riding in the pocket of heavy work pants. He extracted a $20 bill, smoothing the creased paper with deliberate care before handing it over. "Keep the change, Mary," he said, reading the faded name tag pinned to the woman's apron. "And wrap up a slice of the cherry pie. Will you put it in a box?" The waitress nodded, her posture relaxing, and walked away. Elena stared at the empty space where the green slip had been. "I am so sorry. I thought the direct deposit cleared. I feel terrible." "You feel human," Arthur finished for her. He leaned forward, resting his forearms on the table, closing the distance between them. "Machines make mistakes. Banks hold transfers. It is paper and plastic, Elena. It does not measure your worth." He did not offer pity. His eyes held only a profound, quiet understanding. He had stood at that exact register, counting nickels and dimes, to buy Leo a carton of milk, while the line grew restless and judgmental behind him. He knew the metallic taste of that specific humiliation. He refused to let her swallow it. The waitress returned, placing a white cardboard box on the table. Arthur slid the box toward Elena. "For your late shift tomorrow. Sugar keeps the eyes open when the coffee stops working." Elena looked at the small square box. A slice of pie. $3.50. To a billionaire, it was microscopic noise on a balance sheet. To the woman she was pretending to be, and to the man sitting across from her, it represented an hour of backbreaking labor. It was the most expensive gift she had ever received. She traced the edge of the cardboard, her chest tightening with an unfamiliar ache. The fortress of ice she had built around her heart over the years developed a microscopic, irreparable crack. She had built a trap to catch a predator, but she had ensnared something infinitely more valuable. She had found a good man, and she was lying to him. The hallway of the building smelled of wet plaster, boiled onions, and fading exhaust fumes. The narrow staircase required a careful negotiation of warped wood and protruding nails. Elena clutched a brown paper bag, holding 2 generic brand muffins, her knuckles white. She reached door 4B. The brass numeral hung crookedly anchored by a single rusting screw. She raised her hand and tapped the peeling wood. Arthur opened the door. He wore a faded gray t-shirt that stretched tight across his broad shoulders, the cotton worn thin from countless cycles in a cheap laundromat. A faint smudge of engine grease shadowed his left jawline, a stubborn remnant of his 10-hour shift. He offered a warm, grounded smile that reached the corners of his tired eyes. "You navigated the labyrinth," he rumbled, his deep voice vibrating in the narrow space. He stepped aside, pulling the door open wider. "I followed the scent of pine cleaner in pure survival," she replied, offering the crinkled bag. "I brought breakfast for your early shift tomorrow." He took the bag gently, his large fingers briefly brushing against hers. A spark of static electricity jumped between them. "Thank you. Come in. Watch the dip in the floorboard by the radiator it tends to bite." The apartment revealed itself in a single sweeping glance. It was a shoebox. A tiny galley kitchen bled directly into a square living area that doubled as a sleeping quarter. Yet, the space commanded immediate respect. It was immaculate. Paperback books stacked in perfect towering columns. Cheap ceramic dishes washed and gleaming on a plastic drying rack. The faded threadbare rug vacuumed until the surviving fibers stood at attention. Poverty dictated the square footage of this room, but a fierce, unyielding dignity arranged the furniture. In the exact center of the rug sat Leo. The 7-year-old possessed his father's dark, observant eyes set deep in a pale, narrow face. A scattering of broken crayons formed a messy, colorful halo around him on the linoleum. He paused mid-stroke, staring up at the stranger invading his private sanctuary. Leo. Arthur crouched, his heavy boots squeaking slightly, his voice dropping to a soothing, gentle baritone. This is Elena. She works very hard, just like we talked about. The boy assessed her in silence. He did not care about the subtle cut of her thrifted sweater or her posture. He searched for the invisible frequency adults carried, sniffing out deception or danger. Elena knelt, ignoring the sharp protest of her stiff jeans, bringing herself completely down to his eye level. "Hello, Leo," she said softly, keeping her hands visible and still. He extended a sheet of lined notebook paper. "It is a rocket. It goes to the moon because the Earth is too loud." Elena took the paper. The blue crayon lines pressed deep into the page, carrying the fierce, chaotic determination of a child trying to escape gravity. "It is a brilliant design. The aerodynamics look very solid. It will definitely reach the moon." A tiny, proud smile cracked the boy's serious expression. He retreated to his father, wrapping a thin, fragile arm around Arthur's thick thigh. Arthur ruffled the boy's dark hair, his rough hand infinitely gentle. "Go brush your teeth, spaceman. 10 minutes." As Leo scampered toward the tiny, windowless bathroom, Arthur moved to the worn sofa. He gestured for Elena to sit. The floral cushions exhaled a dusty sigh under her weight, swallowing her down. Arthur pulled a wooden stool from the kitchen counter and sat directly across from her. He reached into a chipped ceramic bowl on the coffee table and pulled out a spool of black thread, a silver needle, and a small pair of metal clippers. Next to the bowl lay a child's winter coat. The zipper hung loose, the thick nylon fabric torn jaggedly near the collar. Elena watched in silence, holding her breath. She expected him to apologize for the domestic chore. She expected him to hide the broken thing, ashamed of the fraying edges of his life. Instead, Arthur held the tiny needle up to the dim light of the single floor lamp. He narrowed his eyes. His hands, massive and heavily scarred by years of wrestling with iron-rusted bolts and engine blocks, possessed an unexpected, quiet grace. The knuckles bore the pale, raised maps of old chemical burns. Thick calluses padded his fingertips, rendering them nearly insensitive to heat. Yet those rough, heavy instruments pinched the fragile cotton thread, guiding it through the microscopic eye of the needle on the very first try. He began to sew. Push, pull, tighten. A steady, rhythmic motion. Elena sat frozen, mesmerized by the hypnotic movement of his hands. In her corporate world, broken things were discarded. A torn seam meant a trip to the tailor or tossing the garment into the trash bin. A broken business relationship meant a swift legal settlement and an ironclad gag order. No one repaired anything. Everyone simply replaced. Here sat a man who spent his daylight hours breathing toxic exhaust fumes and bending rigid steel, spending his night meticulously anchoring a torn collar so his son would not feel the bitter winter wind on his neck tomorrow morning. He did not curse the unfairness of the universe. He simply threaded the needle and closed the gap. The cheap space heater in the corner ticked, radiating an uneven orange glow. Elena possessed a penthouse with heated marble floors, smart climate control, and panoramic views of the entire skyline. She hosted charity galas where the centerpieces cost more than Arthur's annual rent. Yet sitting on this sagging, uncomfortable couch, breathing in the scent of cheap laundry detergent and old wood, she felt an entirely alien sensation. Warmth. A deep, resonant, anchoring warmth that settled heavy into her bones. and chased away the chronic, icy chill of her corporate fortress. This tiny, drafty, crowded room held more genuine security than her heavily guarded, sprawling estate. Arthur bit the end of the thread, snapping it clean with his teeth. He smoothed the repaired seam with his heavy thumb, inspecting his handiwork. "He grows an inch a month," Arthur murmured, folding the small coat neatly over his knee. "I buy them big, but he finds a way to tear them anyway. The playground is a battlefield for a kid." He looked up, catching her intense, unblinking gaze. He misinterpreted her prolonged silence. "It is not much, Elena." He gestured to the small room, a brief shadow of insecurity passing over his hardened features. "I know it is tight. I know it is. Loud with the street traffic outside, but the roof holds the rain out." "It is a home," Elena whispered. Her voice fractured in the middle. She swallowed hard, forcing the words past the thick, heavy knot anchoring itself in her throat. "It is a beautiful home, Arthur." She looked at his scarred hands resting over the folded coat. She wanted to reach out across the coffee table and trace the maps of his burns. She harbored an overwhelming urge to confess the millions resting silently in her offshore accounts, to lay her true self completely bare, and beg him to let her stay in this quiet, honest space forever. But the lie chained her tongue. She was merely a tourist in his reality. And as Leo padded back into the room in faded, mismatched pajamas, clutching his one-eyed bear, Elena realized a terrifying truth. She was falling deeply in love with a man she was actively deceiving. The weekend air tasted of roasted peanuts and exhaust. Arthur had saved enough overtime pay for a rare Saturday excursion. A city park, free admission. Elena walked beside him, her hands tucked deep into the pockets of her oversized coat. Ahead of them, Leo chased a flock of indifferent pigeons, his laughter a bright, clear bell ringing through the smog. They sat on a splintered green bench. Elena broke a soft pretzel in half, offering the larger piece to Arthur. He took it, their fingers brushing. A quiet comfort settled over them, fragile as spun glass. Then a shadow eclipsed the afternoon sun. The scent arrived first. A thick, suffocating wave of designer cologne, masking the sharp tang of stale cigars. Elena looked up. The couple stood blocking the paved walkway. The man wore a tailored navy blazer, his wrist weighed down by a bulky, ostentatious gold watch. The woman beside him carried a leather handbag that cost more than Arthur's annual rent. Her lips were painted a sharp, surgical red. Arthur went completely still. The half-eaten pretzel lowered. The warmth bled out of his face, replaced by a gray, hardened stoicism. "Well, look who crawled out of the garage." The man's voice possessed the slick, oily texture of an untrustworthy salesman. "Marcus," Arthur acknowledged. His voice held no tremor. It was a flat, deadened sound. He shifted his gaze to the woman. "Chloe." Elena pieced the puzzle together in a fraction of a second. The ex-wife. The woman who traded the smell of motor oil for imported leather. Chloe did not look at Arthur. Her eyes darted toward the grass, landing on the small boy in the faded jacket. A brief, complicated flicker crossed her features before she smoothed it away, replacing it with a mask of polished indifference. "He needs new shoes, Arthur," Chloe stated, her tone dripping with passive-aggressive pity. "Those sneakers are peeling at the soles. It is embarrassing." Arthur stood. He did not rush. He simply unfolded his tall frame, placing himself directly between the wealthy couple and his son. He became a physical wall. "His feet are warm, Chloe. He is well." Marcus let out a short, barking laugh. He adjusted his silk pocket square, his eyes sweeping over Arthur before landing heavily on Elena. He took in her scuffed boots, the frayed edges of her thrifted coat, her lack of makeup. A cruel, knowing smirk twisted his mouth. "I see you found someone in your own tax bracket, Artie," Marcus sneered. He leaned forward, dropping his voice to a conspiratorial whisper that was meant to carry. "Good for you. Keep expectations low. A grease monkey and a charity case. You two can pool your food stamps for a romantic dinner." A thick, suffocating silence dropped over the park bench. Elena expected the explosion. In the boardrooms, she dominated. An insult of this magnitude triggered immediate ruthless retaliation. Lawsuits, terminations, complete financial ruin. She waited for Arthur to clench his massive calloused fists. She waited for the crack of bone against bone. Arthur's jaw locked. The tendons in his thick neck pulled taut like industrial steel cables. His knuckles turned the color of old bone as he gripped the back of the wooden bench. The sheer, terrifying physical power contained within his frame pulsed just beneath the surface. He could dismantle Marcus in 3 seconds. He could shatter that arrogant jaw with a single swing. He did nothing. He looked at his son playing oblivious in the grass 20 feet away. A fight meant police. Police meant an arrest record. An arrest record meant social services knocking on his door, questioning his ability to provide a safe home. It meant Ansa risking the only thing that kept his heart beating. Arthur swallowed the poison. He forced his hands to open, pressing his palms flat against his thighs. He absorbed the humiliation, locking it away in the dark, bruised corners of his soul. "Enjoy your walk, Marcus," Arthur said, his voice dropping to a gravelly whisper. "Step aside." Marcus chuckled a hollow, victorious sound. He patted Arthur's shoulder condescendingly, a touch Arthur bore without flinching, and steered Chloe down the path. Arthur remained standing for a long minute after they left. His broad shoulders sagged, the invisible weight returning to crush his spine. He closed his eyes, taking a slow, ragged breath. Elena remained seated. The blood roared in her ears, cold and lethal. She did not offer empty sympathy. She did not tell him to ignore them. She understood the profound bleeding sacrifice she had just witnessed. A father murdering his own pride to ensure his son's survival. She stared at the retreating back of Marcus. She analyzed the cut of his blazer. She memorized the obnoxious gold watch. She noted the logo of the boutique real estate firm pinned to his lapel. Vance Holdings. In her world, Elena did not scream. She did not throw punches. She dismantled empires. She dismantled them with a pen, a phone call, and a chilling smile. She reached up, wrapping her hand around Arthur's forearm. The muscle beneath his sleeve felt like coiled iron. "Sit down, Arthur," she murmured, her voice steady and anchoring. "The air is better when they are gone." He exhaled, collapsing onto the bench beside her. He scrubbed a hand over his tired face. "I am sorry you had to hear that, Elena. You do not deserve their dirt." "Neither do you," she replied. She looked at the empty path. A promise forged in cold steel solidified in her chest. Marcus thought he had humiliated a helpless mechanic and a penniless woman. He had no idea he had just insulted the apex predator of the city's financial district. The time for pretending was drawing to a close. The bill was coming due, and Elena planned to collect every single cent. The sun surrendered to the jagged skyline, casting long, bruised shadows across the cracked pavement. They occupied the bottom step of Arthur's apartment building. The concrete retained the brutal heat of the afternoon, warming them from beneath. 2 sweating plastic cups of cheap lemon iced tea rested between them. The condensation gathered, swelled, and slid down the smooth plastic, leaving dark, damp rings on the dusty stone. Arthur stared straight ahead at the flickering amber light of a street lamp. He held his cup with both hands, his thick fingers dwarfing the flimsy container. The silence stretching between them held no tension. It carried the heavy, settled weight of survival. He shifted his grip, and the movement exposed a pale, jagged line, slashing across his inner forearm. It was an old injury, healed thick and white against his tanned skin. Elena let her gaze fall upon it. She did not ask. She simply watched the way the street lamp illuminated the rough texture of his skin. "Engine block slipped off the chain hoist," Arthur murmured, catching the direction of her eyes. His voice scraped low, a gravelly vibration, blending with the distant hum of city traffic. Pinched the muscle right against the steel frame. Bled through 3 shop towels before the boss noticed. He traced the scar with his thumb, a slow, unconscious gesture. Physical wounds heal. The body knows how to knit skin back together. It builds a callus. It makes the broken spot thicker, harder to cut a second time. He dropped his hand, letting it rest heavily on his denim-clad knee. The air shifted. The ghost of the park encounter lingered in the twilight. The things that do not leave a mark on the skin. He continued, his tone devoid of self-pity. Those are the ones that take the longest to close. You wondered why I let Marcus speak his poison today. Why I let him walk away. Elena traced the rim of her plastic cup. I wondered how you possessed the strength not to shatter him. She corrected softly. Arthur let out a dry, humorless exhale. Pride is a luxury item, Elena. It costs more than I have in the bank. If I swing my fist, I win the moment. I break his jaw. Then the sirens come. They look at my grease-stained shirt. They look at his Italian silk. And we both know exactly who goes in the back of the cruiser. He turned his head, his dark eyes locking onto hers. The raw vulnerability in his gaze stripped away the remaining oxygen in the humid air. If I go to a cell, social services knocks on my door. They take Leo. They put him in a system that swallows little boys whole. I cannot risk his universe just to protect my ego. So I swallow the dirt. I let them spit their poison, and I build a wall out of it just so my son can walk on clean grass. The words struck Elena with physical force. They fractured the thick ice encasing her chest. In her towering glass office, power meant destruction. Power meant crushing a rival beneath a mountain of litigation. Power meant the loudest voice and the deepest pockets. Arthur redefined the entire concept. True power lived in profound, agonizing restraint. It lived in a father choosing humiliation to ensure a child's safety. A crushing wave of guilt threatened to pull her under. She sat next to a man bleeding genuine truth while she wore a costume woven entirely of lies. She needed to offer him something real. She could not reveal her bank accounts, but she could reveal her soul. I understand the crushing weight of the mask, Elena whispered, her voice trembling slightly as it escaped her throat. She stared at the damp ring on the concrete. I work these jobs. I manage everything. I balance the ledgers. I put out the fires. I keep the entire machine running. People look at me and they just see a function, a producer. They demand endless output, but they never see the exhaustion. She leaned forward, burying her face in her smooth, unblemished hands. The confession poured out a river breaking through a dam. She spoke of her corporate isolation disguised seamlessly as the plight of a weary, indebted worker. I sit in a room full of people, and the silence is deafening. They smile, they shake my hand, but they only want the resources I can provide. If I stop producing, if I falter for a single second, the room empties. I carry the entire structure on my back. There's no one standing behind me to catch the weight if my knees buckle. She lifted her head, meeting his gaze. Tears threatened the corners of her eyes, born of a decade of suffocating loneliness. I'm so tired, Arthur. I'm just so incredibly tired. Arthur did not offer a cliché. He did not tell her to stay positive or that tomorrow held a brighter sun. He simply shifted his weight on the concrete step. He closed the physical distance between them. His broad, heavy shoulder pressed firmly against hers. The contact sent a quiet tremor through her frame. His body heat radiated through her thin sweater, a tangible, anchoring force. You do not have to carry it alone on this step, he rumbled. He moved his scarred hand, resting it open on the space of concrete between them. An invitation. Elena did not hesitate. She uncurled her fingers and placed her hand inside his. His thick fingers closed around hers, a gentle, inescapable grip. Calloused skin met smooth porcelain. The contrast was stark, yet the pieces locked together with flawless precision. They sat in silence as the city roared around them. The blare of a distant taxi, the metallic rattle of a subway train vibrating beneath the grate. But on this specific crumbling step, the chaotic world ceased to exist. Elena rested her head against his shoulder. He smelled of industrial laundry soap and clean, honest sweat. She closed her eyes, inhaling the scent. It was not imported cologne. It was not power. It was pure, unadulterated safety. Wealth could buy islands and politicians, but it could never purchase the quiet, breathing sanctuary she found resting against the arm of a weary mechanic. The letter rested on the scarred kitchen table, a crisp white rectangle mocking the worn wood beneath it. It bore the crest of the city's pediatric respiratory clinic. Arthur stared at the typed numbers. $850. The smog of the city had crept into Leo's small lungs. The cheap inhalers provided by the state clinic no longer kept the wheezing at bay. The specialist prescribed a new targeted therapy. Insurance covered a fraction. The remaining balance sat on the table, a concrete wall between a father and his son's next clean breath. Elena stood by the rusted sink, a damp dish towel hanging idle in her hands. She watched the color drain from Arthur's face. He did not speak. He picked up a pencil, flipping the envelope over to the blank back. He began to write. Rent, utilities, groceries. The pencil lead snapped under the pressure of his grip. He brushed the broken graphite away. The math refused to bend. The numbers remained rigid, indifferent to the quiet desperation in the room. Elena stepped forward. The distance between the sink and the table felt like miles. She looked at the printed bill. $850. To the CEO of a multinational logistics empire, that sum amounted to a rounding error on a Tuesday afternoon catering receipt. She could pull out her phone, tap a screen, and clear the debt before the kettle finished boiling. But Elena, the struggling worker drowning in loans, possessed nothing. The lie trapped her in a suffocating box. "Arthur," she murmured, pulling a chair out and sitting across from him. "Let me help." He kept his eyes on the paper. "It is my responsibility, Elena. I will handle it." She reached across the table, covering the broken pencil with her hand. "I have a jar. A little emergency fund I keep hidden under the floorboards. Tips from the late shifts. It is not much, but it covers this. Let me give it to you." Arthur lifted his head. The exhaustion in his eyes mirrored the gray sky outside the window. He looked at her hand, soft and small, over his rough knuckles. He saw a woman fighting her own battles, offering him her last shield. He turned his hand over, lacing his fingers through hers. He squeezed gently, pushing the offer back across the table. "No," he rumbled, his voice thick with unyielding resolve. "You save those tips. You need a buffer when the winter comes and the heating bills rise. I will not take your survival money to fix my roof. I am a mechanic. I find ways to make things run." He stood up, the chair scraping loud against the linoleum. He folded the bill, tucking it into the breast pocket of his denim shirt right over his heart. He carried the weight. The next week carved itself into Arthur's face. He did not just work the day shift at the garage. He traded his evenings for a mop and a bucket, cleaning the empty halls of a commercial office building across town until 3 in the morning. He slept in 2-hour fragments on the sagging sofa, his boots still laced, a ghost haunting his own apartment. Elena visited on a Thursday evening. She brought a container of hot stew, pretending it was left over from a large batch she cooked to save money. She found Arthur sitting on the edge of the mattress, Leo asleep beside him. Arthur held a small plastic medication bottle, the new prescription. He had secured the medicine. He had paid the toll. But the cost extracted from his body was severe. His cheekbones jutted out sharp and hollow. The skin around his eyes bruised a deep, permanent purple. His hands rested on his knees, and Elena noticed a faint, uncontrollable tremor in his fingers. The engine was running on fumes, tearing itself apart from the inside. She knelt in front of him. She took the plastic bottle from his shaking hand and set it on the nightstand. She wrapped her arms around his waist, resting her cheek against his chest. His heart beat a slow, heavy, labored rhythm beneath his shirt. "You are pouring from an empty cup," she whispered into the worn cotton. Arthur rested his heavy chin on the top of her head. He let out a long, ragged exhale. "The cup does not matter, Elena. The boy is breathing." He closed his eyes, his breathing evening out as exhaustion pulled him under. He fell asleep sitting up anchored only by her presence. Elena held him in the dim light. Cold, sharp clarity pierced her chest. She had created the fake profile to protect herself. She had worn the thrifted clothes to filter out the greed. But the game had mutated. The armor she wore to guard her own heart now served as a weapon, bleeding the man she loved. He was destroying himself to afford a fraction of what she carried in a leather wallet. He was trading his life for pennies, and her deception forced her to stand by and watch. The lie could not survive another sunrise. She needed to dismantle the facade. She needed to lay her empire at his calloused feet and accept whatever judgment he passed down. She closed her eyes, memorizing the steady rhythm of his chest, preparing herself for the storm. The grand atrium of the Vanguard Tower hummed with the quiet, expensive murmur of the city's elite. Crystal chandeliers hung from the vaulted ceiling like frozen rain, casting fractured rainbows across the imported marble floor. Waiters in tailored vests navigated the sea of silk and bespoke suits balancing silver trays of champagne. It was the annual charity gala for the logistics empire Elena commanded. Deep in the bowels of the building, a different rhythm pulsed. A massive, aging climate-controlled generator protested the heavy load. Arthur wiped a bead of sweat from his temple, leaving a streak of dark grease across his skin. His boss had pulled him off his meager dinner half an hour ago. Emergency call, time and a half pay. Arthur needed every extra cent to cover the remaining balance on Leo's medication. He wore his heavy canvas work pants, a faded gray t-shirt, and a thick utility belt sagging with the weight of steel tools. He knelt behind a gilded velvet curtain that separated the service alcove from the main ballroom. The contrast was a sharp, jagged edge. On one side, the scent of roasted duck and rare orchids. On the other, the heavy metallic tang of ozone and engine oil. He tightened a rusted bolt, his muscles straining against the rigid iron. The machine coughed, sputtered, and settled into a steady, reliable hum. He wiped his hands on a rabask, packing his wrenches back into their leather sleeves. A shadow stretched across the marble floor of the alcove, cast by the glittering ballroom light. The clinking of ice against crystal preceded the voice. Well, they really do let anyone in the back door these days. Arthur stopped moving. He recognized the slick, oily cadence. He stood up, his tall frame dwarfing the confined space of the alcove. Marcus Vance stood mere inches away, holding a half-empty glass of amber liquid. He wore a tuxedo that cost more than a reliable used car. A small cluster of his wealthy peers lingered just behind him, their faces painted with mild amusement. They smelled blood in the water. They craved a distraction from the monotonous perfection of their evening. Marcus, Arthur acknowledged his voice in even deadened rumble. He swung his heavy tool bag onto his shoulder, preparing to walk away. Marcus stepped sideways, blocking the narrow exit. Running away so soon, Artie? The party is just starting. Or did the catering staff forget to leave scraps by the dumpster for you? A low chuckle rippled out through the group of men behind Marcus. Arthur gripped the thick canvas strap of his bag. The rough material bit into his calloused palm. He looked past Marcus, staring at the polished brass button on the wall panel. He calculated the physics of the encounter. He possessed the physical leverage to move Marcus aside with a single shove. But a shove meant an altercation. An altercation meant his garage lost the Vanguard Tower contract. It meant a termination slip on his locker door tomorrow morning. "Excuse me," Arthur said. The words tasted like ash. "My job is done here." "Your job," Marcus sneered, swirling his drink. He turned to his audience, raising his voice so it carried over the string quartet playing in the background. "This is the guy I was telling you about. The park mechanic. The one who brought his raggedy little dependent to the public grass because he couldn't afford a movie ticket. And you should see the woman he drags around. A real prize. Probably buys her clothes out of a donation bin." The air in the alcove thickened. The ambient noise of the gala faded into a distant muffled drone. Arthur's jaw locked. The tendons in his neck strained against his skin. He closed his eyes for a fraction of a second. He saw Leo's face, pale and trusting in the dim light of their apartment. He heard the wheeze in his son's lungs, cured only by the medicine bought with this exact humiliation. He swallowed the bile. He anchored his feet to the marble. He became a stone monument, weathering a storm of pure garbage. "Move, Marcus," Arthur rumbled. He did not yell. He stripped all emotion from his tone, leaving only a cold, dense warning. Marcus did not retreat. Emboldened by his audience and the champagne thinning his blood, he stepped closer. He reached out, tapping a manicured finger against Arthur's grease-stained chest. "You do not give orders here, grease monkey. You crawl back down the service elevator. You take your pathetic, empty pockets, and you—" Marcus punctuated his sentence with a careless, arrogant shove. Arthur did not budge. His body absorbed the impact like a brick wall. But the movement shifted the heavy tool bag on his shoulder. The leather flap gave way. A solid steel wrench slipped from its pouch. It struck the marble floor. The sound cracked through the ballroom like a rifle shot. The string quartet faltered. The polite, hushed conversations died. Dozens of heads turned toward the velvet curtain. The elite crowd stared at the jarring spectacle, a towering, grease-stained laborer facing off against one of their own. Marcus smirked, savoring the massive audience. He had successfully dragged Arthur into the spotlight to serve as a prop for his own superiority. He looked down at the heavy wrench on the floor, then kicked it lightly with the toe of his polished Italian shoe. "Pick it up," Marcus ordered, his voice echoing in the vast, silent room. "Pick up your trash mechanic. And while you are down there, maybe you can shine my shoes. I will give you a crisp 20. Might buy your little charity case girlfriend a decent meal." Arthur stared at the wrench. The cold metal rested on the pristine marble. The weight of 1,000 judging eyes pressed down on his spine. The room waited for his submission. They waited for him to bend the knee. He let out a slow, controlled breath. He released his grip on his pride, letting it shatter completely on the floor beside the tool. He did it for the boy. Arthur slowly bent his knees. Arthur's knee bent. The coarse fabric of his work pants stretched over his joint. He traded his dignity for a bottle of pills and a child's quiet breath. The sharp, rhythmic strike of a stiletto heel against the polished marble echoed through the grand hall. A singular, commanding tempo. The murmuring crowd parted. They did not just step aside, they retreated, pulling back like a tide conceding the shore to a hurricane. Arthur kept his gaze anchored to the floor, focused entirely on the steel wrench. He reached his hand down. A sleek, midnight blue silk heel stepped directly into his line of sight, planting itself inches from the fallen tool. "Stand up, Arthur." The voice possessed the smooth, chilling clarity of a winter lake. It was a voice accustomed to ending negotiations with a single syllable. Yet beneath the freezing authority, Arthur recognized the cadence. He knew that pitch. It belonged to the woman who sat on his crumbling concrete step and shared a cheap lemon-iced tea. Arthur slowly straightened his spine. He lifted his chin. Elena stood before him. The oversized, thrifted coat and the defensive posture had vanished, replaced by a custom-tailored gown that fell around her like liquid armor. A delicate, flawless diamond rested at the hollow of her throat, catching the light of 1,000 chandeliers. She did not look exhausted. She looked like a sovereign inspecting her domain. Marcus Vance froze. The smug, victorious sneer melted off his face, replaced by a pale, glistening sheen of panic. He recognized the apex predator of his ecosystem. Everyone in the room knew the owner of Vanguard Logistics. "Miss Sterling," Marcus stammered, his voice climbing an octave, shedding its arrogant weight. He took a hasty step backward, bumping into the velvet curtain. He attempted a sycophantic smile, gesturing wildly. "I apologize for the disruption. We had a pest problem. A laborer wandering where he doesn't belong. I was just handling it." Elena did not blink. She turned her head, shifting her icy gaze from Arthur to Marcus. The temperature in the alcove plummeted. "Vance Holdings," Elena stated. She did not ask. She cataloged the information like a coroner examining a slide. "You submitted a proposal last Tuesday for the downtown freight distribution contract. You also lease the 42nd floor of this very building." Marcus nodded eagerly, sensing an opportunity utterly blind to the blade resting against his neck. "Yes, ma'am. We are very eager to expand our partnership with Vanguard. I can assure you our firm represents the highest tier of—" "Your proposal is rejected," Elena cut through his sentence. The words acted as a guillotine, swift and definitive. Marcus choked on his breath. Excuse me." "Your proposal is rejected," Elena repeated her tone, lowering into a dangerous quiet register. "Furthermore, Vanguard Tower will not renew your commercial lease at the end of the quarter. You have 90 days to vacate my property." A collective stifled gasp rippled through the onlookers. Marcus opened his mouth, but no sound emerged. His chest heaved. The financial ruin calculating in his eyes mirrored a sinking ship. He lost his prime real estate and his biggest client in a span of 10 seconds. "Miss Sterling, please. There must be a misunderstanding." Marcus pleaded, his hands trembling as he reached out in a futile gesture of diplomacy. "If this is about the noise, I take full responsibility. Elena stepped closer to him. She invaded his space, forcing him to shrink against the wall. "There is no misunderstanding, Marcus," she murmured, ensuring only the inner circle heard the venom in her words. "I simply refuse to do business with a man who measures his worth by stepping on the necks of those who build the world he walks in." "You called him a grease monkey. You mocked a child." Marcus stared at her, his mind misfiring, unable to bridge the gap between this billionaire titan and the words she spoke. Elena delivered the final blow. "I also heard you had some thoughts regarding his charity case girlfriend, the one who buys her clothes from a donation bin." The blood drained completely from Marcus's face. His jaw slackened. The realization struck him with the force of a speeding freight train. He looked at the silk gown, the diamonds, the unyielding power radiating from the woman standing before him, and he remembered the faded olive green sweater in the park. He had insulted the queen while she walked disguised among the peasants. "Security," Elena commanded, not bothering to lower her voice. Two broad-shouldered men in dark suits materialized from the shadows of the alcove instantly. "Escort Mr. Vance and his party out through the service elevator. The front doors are reserved for gentlemen." Marcus did not protest. He crumbled. The guards flanked him, steering his hollow, defeated frame toward the back exit. The silence in the ballroom stretched tight, a taut wire waiting to snap. The elite crowd watched mesmerized as one of their own was exiled into the night. Elena turned her back on the retreating figure. She dismissed the crowd with a wave of her hand, and they scattered, desperate to avoid her line of sight. She looked up at Arthur. He stood perfectly still, his heavy chest rising and falling. The grease stained his shirt. The dust of the engine room coated his boots. He processed the silk, the diamonds, the brutal, effortless execution of Marcus Vance. He searched her face, looking past the armor, hunting for the woman who ate at the $3 slice of cherry pie with him in a dingy diner. Elena did not offer an excuse. She did not speak a word. She slowly bent down, her silk dress pooling on the marble floor. She wrapped her manicured, unblemished fingers around the cold, heavy steel of the fallen wrench. She stood holding the tool. She offered it back to him. Arthur took it, sliding it silently into the leather pouch on his hip. Then Elena extended her hand. Not the hand of a CEO commanding a room, but the hand of a woman seeking a sanctuary. Arthur hesitated. He looked at the dark grease staining his knuckles, the rough, calloused ridges of his palms. He looked at her pristine, flawless skin. He did not belong in this light. He belonged in the shadows, fixing broken machines. Elena closed the distance. She reached out and took his hand. She did not flinch at the dirt. She intertwined her fingers with his, pressing her palm flush against the thick, hardened map of his scars. She anchored herself to his quiet strength, raising their joined hands slightly for the entire room to witness. A definitive, unbroken claim. The mechanic and the titan, standing together in the center of the gilded cage. Arthur felt the familiar steady warmth radiating from her touch, and the confusion settled into a profound, grounding truth. The money was a lie, but the woman holding his hand was entirely real. The roar of the gala dissolved into the familiar quiet hum of Arthur's cramped living room. Elena sat on the sagging floral sofa, her midnight blue silk pooling against the scuffed linoleum. She offered the raw truth, laying bare the fortress of deception she built to protect her isolated core. Arthur listened, the ambient street lamp washing over his exhausted features. He harbored no resentment. He understood the suffocating weight of wearing armor to survive. His thick, calloused thumb traced the delicate bones of her wrist, bridging the vast canyon between their realities. A soft shuffle broke the stillness. Leo padded into the room in his mismatched pajamas, clutching his battered bear, his breathing clear and steady. Elena smiled, a genuine, unguarded warmth, replacing her corporate mask. She shifted, opening the space beside her. Arthur wrapped his heavy arms around them both, pulling them close against his chest. The engine of his life, once running on fumes, finally found a steady, enduring rhythm. Thank you for tuning in to Quiet Dad Stories. Arthur chose to endure severe public humiliation, burying his own ego to ensure his son remained safe and provided for. Do you believe true power lies in striking back or in the agonizing silent restraint of protecting the ones you love? Share your perspective in the comments below. If this journey moved you, please leave a like, subscribe to the channel, and tap the notification bell for more stories of quiet sacrifice and unyielding love.